Virtuous Men, a podcast devoted to sharing the...
Welcome to Loose and Unscripted, an inside look at Season 4 of the Virtuous Men podcast. I'm Jamie.
I'm Scott.
And we are the creators of Virtuous Men.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Loose and Unscripted. This is going to be part one of 2 episodes of Loose and Unscripted. As you know, this was our most ambitious season yet, so we thought, why do one when you can do 2 Loose and Unscripteds, right?
That's right. Yeah, this is part 1. We're going to be going through this season episode by episode. And then part 2 is going to be with some special guests.
That's right. They are as special as we're making them out to be right now. We assure you.
So special. So special.
So well, yeah, let's get into this.
Yeah, season 4. I mean, we're done. I mean, it was probably the most, as you say, ambitious and the most time consuming and the hardest we've probably worked on a season in this whole journey so far. In the 2 years we've been podcasting.
Yeah. Well, and I'm still trying to calculate or when we got the idea to do Lewis and Clark, because I want to say that it was probably 7 or 8 months ago, which seems like a very long time, but that seems right to me that it was that long.
It was definitely before it was before you took off on your grand adventure.
Yeah. So probably within the 6 to 7 month range, but yeah, I mean, I had always wanted to do Lewis and Clark in some form, and we just thought, when I approached you with the idea of doing an entire season devoted just to them, and telling you that we easily have enough information based on the journey and the journals and everything. I mean, there is so much material there that we could easily get a whole season just out of the expedition.
For sure. Yeah, I remember that. We were chatting at your place and we had a whiteboard out and we were brainstorming and you said, what about Lewis and Clark for a whole season? We'd never done a full-length, feature-length season of one subject before. So this was pretty new for us, and I think it turned out well.
Yeah, I'm super proud of how it turned out. I mean, I think one of the most interesting debates that we had was, how many episodes is it going to be? Because when it comes to Lewis and Clark, I mean, there is so much information. I mean, because some of them recorded daily entries for almost 3 years. So, I mean, based on that alone, we could have easily made this way longer, but at some point something's got to give. You know, you got to, at the same time you're telling a story, you got to keep it entertaining. So we figured, based on the information that we had, it was probably going to be about 5 or 4 episodes, and we ended up doing 5.
Yeah, I think 5 was a good number. I've certainly listened to other podcasts on Lewis and Clark, and you know, they're in the 10 to 12 episode range and they have a lot more information, but I know this is a little biased, but I think our telling of the story definitely is unique in the way we told it in a theatrical form, and also as we're Virtuous Men, we highlighted the virtues kind of exemplified throughout each episode, each part of the journey. So yeah, I'm pretty proud of it. I know I always say I think it turned out well. This time I really do mean it. I think it turned out really great.
Oh, yeah. And it really felt like a collaboration between the two of us. I mean, I hesitate to call it a true collaboration because you had your episodes, I had my episodes, but it was unique because we were trying to tie them together in a way that would make sense. So I think that's where the collaborative nature came in, is, so how do we tie this episode into your episode and make it smooth so that it actually transitions in a way that it feels like one complete whole? Yeah, it was definitely quite the process, I gotta say.
All right, well, I think we'll get into it. Let's start with episode 1, of course. That was your episode. Episode 1, Jefferson's Call. This was kind of from the time of the Louisiana Purchase through until the very start of the expedition.
Yeah, that's right. I know that was another thing that was interesting about this season, is what do we call the episodes? And you definitely, I think this episode title was your idea, and I thought it was perfect because Jefferson was truly the author of the journey. I mean, he was the driving force of the entire thing, and you got to give credit where it's due. I know Jefferson is an incredibly controversial figure even today, but he's one of those people where you can't help but admire the good things about him, not and detest the bad things. But I mean, the good stuff was really, really good. And in terms of the Lewis and Clark expedition, I mean, he was the thing that made it happen.
Yeah, I think Larry Morris, the other guy we interviewed for the season, he kind of said it best in episode 1 where he talks about Jefferson right at the start. You know, he recognizes his faults and his failures and some of the things that he did that obviously in our modern 21st century ideals are not the greatest, you know, slavery being the most prominent. But he also respects him as a leader. And I think a theme of this whole project is giving the man the respect that he is due to the time period he was in, recognizing the faults, but also realizing that this guy lived in the 1700s, you know. And I think that's, you have to do that when researching and kind of looking into people of history. You can't just look at them with our ideals of the 21st century and judge them in that light.
Oh yeah, that's totally foolish. I mean, I think you would think that even people back then would recognize that they're not going to judge the ancient Egyptians by their standards, you know. I mean, it's just or something like that, you know. So it's just so interesting, this man of contradictions that was Thomas Jefferson, and the fact that he was pushing for the end of slavery, and yet nobody in American history profited more from slavery than he did. So it's just,
Yeah.
he was such a contradictory figure that it's just hard to wrap your head around someone like that, you know. And so many historical figures are like that, like the particularly great ones. They tend to be contradictory, and none more so than Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about your research on this one. I mean, most of it was probably Jefferson, because Jefferson was the driving force of the expedition towards exploring the West, obviously the Louisiana Purchase, and then what became of the expedition.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't all Jefferson. I mean, because I had kind of planned for this episode to end right as they are getting ready to leave. So it was sort of half Jefferson and then half Lewis as he's starting to get the expedition ready to go. Like if you listen to the episode, it's a lot of it is just the relationship between him and Lewis, you know, because he knew Lewis from childhood, and he was essentially a father figure to him in many ways. So there's that relationship, which is it's really moving in a lot of ways, just kind of seeing how he takes Lewis under his wing and he sees his potential and he sees that he's the perfect man for the job. But yeah, no, it was an interesting episode in the sense that it had a very clear halfway point. So there's the first half where Jefferson is kind of developing his idea for the expedition, and he tries to get it launched a number of times and it fails. But then here comes Meriwether Lewis, and he sees this young man who's incredibly bright. He's extremely intelligent, despite the fact that he's also very troubled. He loves the outdoors, and he's a military man, and he just sees the potential in him, and he realizes this is someone who can do the job. And Lewis, of course, jumps at the opportunity because he recognized that Jefferson had that quality of a father, and you know, his father had passed away when he was just a kid, so he really recognized that relationship for what it was, I think, and they both made the most of it, and more credit to them for that.
So what was your favorite part of episode 1?
Yeah, that was a tough one because I think of all the episodes we did, this one probably had the least amount of like really big standout moments because it's kind of like the beginning of everything. So I think if I had to pick, it would just be when Lewis and when this is after Clark has joined and they're trying to get the men together. I just thought that was a really interesting part to research, is looking into the individual men, because you never hear about them. It's always just Lewis and Clark, and then that's it. You never hear anything about the other men, and Sacagawea, of course, with an exception there. But you never hear about the other men of the expedition. So researching them and learning their stories, and then putting that in the episode was really fascinating. And especially too, you really see how each man was perfectly selected for the job based on their skills. And Lewis and Clark were so good at that. They were so good at recognizing the strengths that each of the men had. So one of them was the best fisherman, one of them was the best shot, one of them was the best interpreter for Indian languages. So I mean, they just had a real knack for selecting the right men for the right jobs.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me a lot of Shackleton. You know, that was one of my episodes in our first
absolutely.
season, and how he picked men for this expedition they went on to the Antarctic. it was very much like that, and he just had a sixth sense when he met someone if they were expedition material or not. He would ask silly questions like, "Can you sing?" you know, and it seems completely irrelevant, but he knew those things, those qualities were important. And I think of Cruzat and his fiddle. How many times do you read through the journals of, oh yeah, Cruzat was playing his fiddle and the natives really enjoyed it and the man really enjoyed it, and it was like a morale booster after a tough day, sitting down by the fire. Cruzat pulls his fiddle out. Little things like that, you think they're insignificant, but they're definitely not. So what was your favorite quote of episode 1?
I thought that the Patrick Gass quote at the end was really good because it really sums up what I thought was the greatest virtue this displayed in the first part of the expedition is their willingness to embrace the unknown. Like, to me, that is the biggest thing, because nothing like this had been done in American history, and these men were well aware of it. They knew full well we are going off the map, and you can't help but feel that sense of dread that they must have felt. But then also it taps into that side of human beings that we have to have some adventure. We have to have some unknowns. We have to take risks. We have to explore. And there is so much of that spirit in the journals that you see in the men. I thought Patrick Gass summed it up really well.
We expect to pass through a country possessed by numerous powerful and warlike nations of savages, of gigantic stature, fierce, treacherous, and cruel, and particularly hostile to white men. But the determined and resolute character of the men dispelled every emotion of fear.
I was trying to scratch in my head, trying to think of the virtue that would exemplify. Maybe undauntedness. Is that a word?
No.
We'll go with it, though.
I think just the virtue of risk. I think it all comes down to that, because these men were taking risks that most of us could never even imagine taking in our lives. And they seem to almost jump into it with enthusiasm.
That's why the Lewis and Clark expedition is such an interesting topic and so gripping, even, so many years later. Okay, so episode 2, Up the Mighty Missouri. What a name. So this one goes from their departure from St. Louis, near St. Louis, up the Missouri, and ends when they reach the Mandan village, and they kind of winter in the Mandan village, and then they're just about to take off in the spring when episode 2 comes to a close.
Yep, that's right.
So what was the research like on this one? Was it? I guess it was a lot more challenging than in the first, maybe, because it involved a lot more of the journals, right?
I mean, it was the very beginning of the voyage, so I mean, every element is there. You have the exploration element, you have the Indian encounter element, you have the harsh weather element, you have all of these elements right there that persisted from beginning to end, and it all kind of starts right as they set off on the Missouri. And I think, especially too, one thing that struck me was the difficulty of going up the Missouri, the fact that they were against the current. I mean, I can't imagine how difficult that job must have been, and I didn't really get a chance to emphasize it as much in the episode with sound effects and everything like that, but just imagining the men having to pull the keel boat from the shore with ropes. I mean, I just cannot imagine how brutal the work must have been just getting the boat up the river. I mean, I can't imagine it.
Yeah, it blows my mind that they actually made it thousands of miles against the current with a massive boat.
And it was a very clumsy boat too. I mean, if you
yeah,
there was actually I watched a documentary about it was like a really old History Channel documentary about the technology of Lewis and Clark, and they went into a whole 5-minute scene of talking just about the boat, and it went through the actual design and what it looked like and how it functioned, and it was just a really clumsy, bulky thing that got the job done. But I mean, it was just a very unwieldy piece of technology for that time.
Right. Not meant to do what they did with it, for sure. So episode 2, what was your favorite part? What was your favorite part of the end product?
Favorite part of this one was probably the theatrical intro. because that was the most sound effects heavy that I got, and it just worked really well, exactly how I wanted it to work. Because very often I think you and I are kind of different in the way that we approach the episodes, where I tend to kind of go in blind and I don't really know what scenes are going to have lots of sound effects beforehand. So, or just moments where it's just sound and no music or anything like that. Like I don't go in with a game plan knowing when those moments are. I kind of just let the episode guide me. The theatrical intro felt right because that's where they are stumbling through the brush and they're frustrated. They have no idea if they even want to keep going or if it's even worth it. And then they stumble across the landscape of unexplored wild America in all its beauty. And they just realize, yes, like this right here, what we're looking at, this is worth it. And I really, truly believe that that's how they felt while they were exploring and just realizing once they see the landscape and they look at the land of their country in all of its beauty, they just realize this is worth whatever we have to do to claim it for the country.
Yeah, I'm just so jealous to think about the fact that somebody stood on a bluff and looked over it and was able to see 5,000 buffalo.
Yeah.
Just to imagine that sight was just jaw-dropping, like what that must have looked like. These guys have never seen buffalo before, and you go out there and you see thousands upon thousands of them.
And you just read, and that part of the journals in the research was especially interesting because practically every day they were discovering something new. I just imagine how exciting that must have been, where every day you see some animal that's never been recorded for science. And Lewis in particular was probably just like a kid in a candy store. You know, he probably couldn't write fast enough. He couldn't draw fast enough. I mean, he was probably just firing on all cylinders every day of that portion of the journey where every day practically was something new.
I actually think of our trip together. We took a trip to Wind Cave.
Yeah, Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Custer State Park and the buffalo that we saw there. I mean, that was incredible to see that.
That's right, yeah.
Just to think of, I mean, that on a absolutely exponential scale must have just been out of this world.
It's also amazing, too, in researching it, how in that particular portion of the journey, the hunting was so good and the game was so numerous and abundant that they could eat 9 pounds of meat a day, every man on the expedition, which is 40 plus men.
Yeah, they were eating 350 pounds a day.
Yeah, well, I think
insane.
and I think it might have been Stephen Ambrose's book Undaunted Courage, which was a major source of my research. I think he described it as the elk were as numerous as the birds. Like, I just think, wow, I just can't imagine that. Yeah, exactly like you said, like it gives you such a great glimpse as to what our country looked like before the Industrial Revolution and before Manifest Destiny really took hold. I mean, it just really paints a picture of what the land looked like and makes you hunger to see it that way again, even though we never will. But still, it's a beautiful picture of the past.
So what about a favorite quote from this one?
This one was also from the theatrical intro. This quote is actually unique because it isn't all one quote. I took it from 2 separate journal entries and combined it into one.
The lands are extremely fertile, exhibiting one of the most beautiful scenes I have ever beheld. This immense river waters one of the fairest portions of the globe, nor do I believe that there is in this universe a similar extent of country. As we passed on, it seemed as if those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end. Meriwether Lewis, 1804, 1805.
Yeah, that gives you a sense of, you can see it in the words that he's writing, that he's just in awe of what he's looking at.
And you get a sense, too, I don't know about Clark so much, because between the two of them, Clark was far and away the worst of the two in terms of writing.
Yeah.
Because Lewis was wonderfully descriptive, and you really get a sense that you're getting into his mind and feeling what he's feeling. And Clark, there isn't really as much of that.
Saw a buffalo. Period.
Yes, exactly. Shot a bear. Bear was very heavy. Yeah, but with Lewis, you really get a sense that he's really taking it all in, and you get that sense that he maintained that childlike wonder for the entire journey.
So then, what did you learn when you're going through this, going through the research, writing the episode? What did you learn, or what virtue would you say is paramount for episode 2?
I think the one that really stands out for this portion of the journey is the and we haven't talked about this yet, but the hospitality and the friendship between the Indian tribes and the Lewis and Clark expedition, especially the Mandans, because without that they would have failed miserably. They would have all died, especially given the winter that they endured. And that's one of the most interesting things about the expedition is the fact that they encountered 40 plus tribes, I think, or maybe more than that, I think. And they really only had trouble with the Sioux and I think the Skaloot or Chinook. I can't remember which tribe.
Yeah, the Skaloot were particularly
on their way back.
Not really much of a threat to their lives, but more just pilfering and stealing things.
Right. But then there's the Sioux, who were genuine threats to their lives because they were such a powerful force, and they were so feared and renowned that even Jefferson knew about them. So they had a pretty lofty reputation. So I mean, it was another one of those cases where had they not let them pass, the journey would have failed.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, I think it's interesting that the Sioux, who gave Lewis and Clark the most trouble, what became of them, and the trouble that the U.S. government had with them. Obviously, the most famous incident between U.S. government and the Indians was the Little Bighorn.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, which that would be a great episode to do at some point.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. The history is kind of a rabbit hole, but the history of the Indians and what happened after Lewis and Clark. I think Larry Morris, the guy we interviewed for the season, he goes into it in one of his books. What happened to the West and what happened to the Indians, and I think there were obviously, like the Sioux, troublesome tribes who just didn't want anything to do with whites and wanted to see them never set foot on their land or have anything to do with them. But I think most of the Indian tribes were very hospitable, and it's just sad what happened, because it seemed like every time a treaty was signed, the U.S. government would break it. They would change the wording. They would restrict the boundaries of the reservations that they had already made. And you look at the Nez Perce, who we'll get into in episode 3 and 4, but they really did help Lewis and Clark, and without them, Lewis and Clark would have really struggled. And especially if the Nez Perce would have been hostile, the expedition may not have made it to the Pacific. So, and then to see what happened to the Nez Perce, they were hunted down by the U.S. government and completely destroyed. So it's very sad what happened to the natives, all the native tribes that Lewis and Clark encountered.
Yeah, it's a very sad and shameful part of our history. But then I think that that's what makes the Lewis and Clark expedition so unique, is that you see what it could have been like had those relations lasted, because you see that genuine friendship and companionship. And and Lewis in particular, like, there was one of the chiefs at the Mandan villages, like, he said, I can't remember the exact quote, but he just really praised him highly and said he was just one of the most amazing men he ever knew. And they didn't even speak the same language, I mean, it's a really beautiful picture of cultures not clashing, but collaborating and embracing one another. And it's just a really beautiful thing to see that throughout the expedition. And I feel like that's definitely a lesson we can learn from today. I mean, I think that is one of the major lessons of the Lewis and Clark expedition, is the fact that we as human beings can be separated by continents and oceans and cultures and languages, but we are not that different from one another when you get down to it. So, episode 3, Canoeing the Mountains. I always thought that was an interesting title, because I just get this picture of them actually canoeing over the mountains, like on the rock and everything. So it's just...
I actually have a book named Canoeing the Mountains, that it's actually about leadership and ministry, and sometimes it can seem like you're canoeing the mountains, and they liken it to Lewis and Clark's journey. And the fact that they got to the Rockies and said, "Uh-oh,
Yeah.
this is not going to work."
No,
But
I was definitely jealous of you for this particular episode because there were so many amazing sequences.
yeah, for sure. I think I hit the jackpot with 3 and 4. I don't know about you, but I thought I got some of the greatest moments in the whole expedition.
I know I really got the impression from the research that we were sharing and the questions that you were going to ask our interviewees, but I got the sense that you were extremely fascinated by old Toby.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, the guy he wasn't flawless for sure. He got lost a few times when they were going through the bitter roots, but he and his son really saved them. Like, how would they have even got through the bitter roots without the guide that they had? And then the fact that this is skipping to episode 4, but the fact that he just kind of took off without even saying, "Hey, I'm leaving now," and he stole their horses and took off and went back to his people was kind of hilarious.
Yeah, definitely an unfitting end for yet another person who saved the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yeah, yet another Indian.
Yeah, that's another thing too that I feel like people back then were masters of understatement. So when something really when something really incredible happens, they tend to kind of just talk about it as if it's just another day at the office, you know. When Sacagawea reunites with her brother, I mean, that's like a coincidence that could only happen by providence.
Yeah, Lewis's quote from that scene is kind of one of my favorite ones, I think, where he's talking about the meeting between her and the other Shoshone woman who was kidnapped at the same time. He says the meeting between those people was really affecting. And I think Lewis was definitely more in touch with his emotions and actually being able to talk about and display those in the text of the journals. Clark really he wasn't one to talk about his emotions for sure.
Oh yeah, it's one of the great contrasts in their personalities, and just the fact that Lewis had more formal education than Clark. So I think Lewis was already much better equipped to write out his personality and his thoughts on paper than Clark probably was. But
Right.
still, between the two of them, you get pretty much a complete picture of everything.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's kind of I kind of thought about it when I was going through this is it's kind of like the Gospels. You get 4 accounts from 4 different people of the same story, and you get different tidbits and information from each one. Each gospel focuses on a different theme of Christ's time on earth, and I think the expedition does the same. It focuses on different aspects through the minds of Lewis, Clark, Whitehouse, Ordway. Who am I forgetting here?
Gas.
Old Gassy, as we affectionately call him.
That was one of the greatest things. So very often will, or at least me, you tend to not do it as much, but I like to put jokes in the first drafts of every episode we do, and every time Gas's name was mentioned I would add a fart sound. It was beautiful.
Yeah, and I want to mention for episode 3, of course, my wife Stacy. She was acting the part of Sacagawea as she meets Kamehameha, her brother. She shouts Bavi, which means brother or chief in Shoshone, and then he says Nami, which means sister.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, that was kind of a fun one to record because she's like back in my office here, and I'm like, okay, stand by the door, and then like walk towards the microphone, and it's kind of a funny one to record. And she's like, how does that? I'm like, well, that's not. Let's try that again, and it was kind of a funny
Stacy's
one.
the unsung hero of season 4.
Yeah, the unsung hero of all these theatrical moments in the episodes.
Well, I personally thought your best sequence in episode 3 was when the canoes overturned and they almost lost everything. I thought you really nailed that sequence.
Yeah, and Sacagawea saves the day. She's somehow holding a baby and is able to stay in the boat or hang on to the boat and grab all these items that are floating down the river. I mean, wow.
Yeah. You just generally did a good job of highlighting her contributions because I feel like there was more of that in your episodes than mine, because with mine you kind of just are introduced to her and then it moves on to what you do. So you,
Yeah.
of the sequences that you had, you definitely had the chance to highlight her contribution, and you did a good job there.
Yeah, I think there's a reason why she's the historical woman with the most monuments in this country of ours.
Yeah, or she has more statues erected in her memory than any woman in American history, for a very good reason.
Yeah, I mean, she was so young. It's incredible. She was, 16 or 17 when she joined the Corps, and like I can't imagine. I have two small kids, and one of which is 1 year old right now, and I can't imagine bringing a baby from birth, on the river, across the Bitterroots, on the Columbia, all the way to the coast, going through the winter at Fort Clatsop. I mean, I just can't imagine what that must have been like.
And you really get a sense too, like just in the way that Lewis and Clark describe her, that she was a very stoic person. She didn't really show a lot of emotion. She just had a quiet dignity about her, except for when she encounters her brother. And I sort of imagine too, like in that particular moment, that Lewis and Clark must have just been totally shocked by this normally really stoic, quiet, mild-tempered woman just exploding in this moment of emotion. It must have just been really startling to them to see that from
Yeah.
her, I would think.
It was also a huge deal, not just for Chicagoea, but for the Corps, because they needed the Shoshone so badly. They needed their help to get over the mountains. They needed horses. And so, as we say in the episode, they tried the Lemhi River and the Salmon River to navigate that, but it was impassable. So they needed horses. They needed to go over the mountains. So without the Shoshone, they would have really, really struggled.
And I think right after that scene, you get, of course, one of the greatest quotes from Lewis for the whole journey, where he approaches his 31st birthday and he describes how he's feeling. I feel like that was an amazing quote.
Yeah, speaking of quotes, yeah, I was gonna say my favorite quote. That it's so good because you think of this guy who's went from St. Louis, he's in, western Montana on the border of Idaho. That's a long distance to go. He's got all of these men, led them through all the struggles, everything he's accomplished, and he's sitting saying, I'm 30 and I really haven't accomplished much in my life, and I really need to try to accomplish more for the succeeding generation. And he was really concerned about that, and I thought that was kind of interesting for a guy who wasn't married, didn't have kids, that he was consumed by this need to pass on something of worth to the next generation. I think that's really admirable.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and listening to that scene again and hearing that quote again, it really made me think of the Ken Burns documentary about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and one of the historians that Ken Burns interviewed, describing that he, before going into the detail of what Lewis is talking about, he lists off all the things that Lewis had accomplished before the age of 31, and it's more than dozens of men could ever hope to achieve in their lifetime. And he remarks that Lewis still was in that mindset of, I don't feel like I have really done enough with my life. And you just think, none of us hardly have done anything like that. And yet he still is feeling that sense of, wow, I haven't done hardly anything. It's a remarkable statement.
It is. And it makes you think, wow, what have I done? If this guy's feeling that way, what have I done? I think another one of my favorite quotes, and we'll play this one. It's at the beginning of episode 3, where Lewis is departing the Mandan village, and he, a nod to your theatrical intro, he's seeing this just incredibly beautiful, wide open country, and now they're going into the unknown.
We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine, and these little vessels contained every article by which we were to expect to subsist or defend ourselves. Meriwether Lewis, April 7th, 1805.
You really get a sense from that he understood that, well, here we go. We're stepping into the unknown. No one has ever really explored this area other than the natives that we're going to encounter. And another really interesting fact that I didn't realize until I was reading Alan Woodger's book, they didn't encounter a single Indian for 4 months from the time they left the Mandan until they got to the Shoshone.
Oh, wow, really?
And that is incredible.
I never came across that fact. Wow, that's pretty amazing. Wow.
And that's another one of the, it's in the chapter or in the section she writes about the happy coincidences of the Corps. The fact that they didn't have any conflicts. They didn't even see an Indian for 4 months when they had this. It's in the episode, in episode 3, they come across this Shoshone on horseback. And that was the first Indian they'd seen since they left the Mandans.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
So
Yeah,
you think about the country they're in, though. Lewis's quote, they were going through country that was dozens of native tribes along the river, but they never saw a single one. And that kind of shows how wide open a space it was they were going through.
yeah. Well, it gives you a sense of the vastness of the American landscape. Like, for all of our listeners who have driven across the country, you know that there are portions where you can't imagine anybody living there, so almost half a year they didn't even see any. That's an amazing fact. I didn't know that.
I think that's actually something really cool about this country, the fact that you can go to places still in 2023 and you can be there for weeks and you probably won't run into anyone unless you want to.
Maybe some Sasquatch if they're real, but
Well, no, that's episode 4 when they get to the Northwest.
Yeah, right. Perhaps. No journal entries about that, but well, they say that Lewis didn't write for a huge chunk of it. Maybe he was so shocked by a Sasquatch encounter that it rendered him incapable of writing for a year at a time.
He was speechless.
Literally.
I would actually love to read a Lewis and Clark quote where he describes a Sasquatch.
If it was Clark, it would be really, really bland. Something like, encountered giant ape man today, 8 foot tall. So what virtue in particular stands out to you in this portion of the journey?
I think it was the fact that no matter what obstacles they faced, and in episode 3, they truly do face all manner of obstacles on the river, communication barriers between themselves and the natives. The fact that when they reach the Shoshone and they can't find them, they're seeing signs, but they can't find them. And then finally they do. And just the level of just not giving up. I think it's really a mark of greatness for great explorers. Some weren't necessarily the most skilled, but their place in history isn't lost because what sets them apart is the fact that they just didn't give up. Again, I go back to Shackleton, and I thought of Shackleton so much when I was researching and going through this season. Just Shackleton made many mistakes. In his famous expedition, he made so many mistakes, but he didn't give up, and he always had, the wherewithal to say, okay, things are really bad, but we're not going to give up, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to try this. We're going to use what resources we still have to get to where we need to go, and Lewis and Clark really did that too. It's a lesson for our own lives to never give up, no matter what situation we're going through, and they certainly did that, and through great leadership of Lewis and Clark, and through noble acts of the men around them, the men under their leadership, they did it.
I think too, it also kind of just makes me think of researching it. I would think to myself, what would this have been like if Clark had not been there? Like if it was just Lewis by himself, I just think, and their strengths complement each other so well, and it just makes you wonder, what if Clark had not been there? Because like in episode 1, like it was a very real possibility that he may not have been able to join the expedition, or he may not have wanted to.
Yeah, I think it's something we want to get into in part 2 of this Loose and Unscripted, the relationship between Lewis and Clark. And I didn't bring it up when we're talking about episode 1, but just a letter between them. When Lewis sends Clark the letter and asks him if he would accompany him on the expedition, the care that he has for Clark and the fond memories he has of their relationship really comes through in that letter. And then Clark's response is just so cool to see. what a brotherhood they had and how much they cared deeply about each other. He says, "I will surely accompany you on this endeavor, and we'll go through all the struggles, and surely we're gonna meet obstacles along the way, but there's no one I'd rather go with this journey on." And yeah, their friendship is really something that is highlighted throughout, and I thought it was cool the fact that we had Ethan and Jared reading those quotes, and we'll get into that more in part 2 teaser.
So we move on to episode 4, Ocean in View. And I was especially excited to hear this one because I just thought there were so many great heroic moments in this part of the journey. And I thought, what is Jamie going to do with it?
Yeah, well, I hope you weren't disappointed.
No, I was. Yeah.
Well, I think my favorite part of this one is the obvious one, Ocean in View. What else? The sheer joy and relief it must have been when they finally saw the ocean. I do wonder, what Lewis would have said in that moment and what that journal entry would have been like. It would have been more descriptive for sure. It is a shame that we didn't get to hear Lewis's thoughts on seeing the ocean.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. There's so many moments in the expedition where you just wonder what Lewis was thinking, especially for such a heroic moment, because that was the crux of the journey. That was the goal, was to get to the ocean. And you wonder, or maybe he was so overwhelmed that he just couldn't write anything. It just kind of makes you wonder that too.
Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean, which we have been so long anxious to see. William Clark, November 7th, 1805.
It was also really great on my travels. Seaside, Oregon has a monument to Lewis and Clark, and it's estimated that spot is where they first saw the ocean. And it's just this monument in the city of Seaside, Oregon, along the beach, and it's sort of estimated that that's where they first saw the ocean. And it was just amazing seeing that monument face to face and realizing this is where they stood over 200 years ago, first looking at the Pacific Ocean that they had spent a year and a half to get to. It's always amazing to go to the actual places where these things happen. There's just something about that never loses its awe for me.
Yeah, for sure. I very recently, a couple of weeks ago, took a trip down with my family, and we visited Seaside and visited the spot you're talking about, and then we took a trip up to Fort Clatsop, and it was really cool actually because I kind of thought, well, I'm the only one who's really going to care about this place. When we got to Clatsop, it's raining. We've got 2 small kids, and is this just going to be like a quick, okay, we saw it, let's get going? But my daughter was just so into it. It was really cool to see. She's 5 and she's in kindergarten, but she's like, "Dad, it's Lewis and Clark, and oh, look, it's Sacagawea." And we were going through the little museum they have in the visitor center, and she was just all about it, and even went into the little theater they have to watch the video that they have of the journey. And I think it was showing the Indian perspective of the core stay in the Northwest. And yeah, it was just cool to see how into it she was. And then they have rangers there, and they have a junior ranger little pamphlet they give the kids, and they fill it out, and then they get their ranger badge, and they hold their hand up and do the ranger pledge. So it's really neat. And anyone who has kids in the Pacific Northwest area, or even if you're coming for a visit, definitely recommend Fort Clatsop, because they really make it cool for the kids too.
That's great. Get them hooked on history at a young age. That's the way to do it.
Yeah, we were going through Fort Clatsop, and my daughter was going through all the various rooms and asking, is this where Sacagawea would sleep? So that was pretty cool. And then we went outside the water gate, the back gate, and there was a guy just working on the grounds, and got chatted to him, told him about the podcast, and he's like, "Oh, it's really cool. It's really cool." And it's just cool to chat to someone who works there about the research we've done and the podcast episodes we put together. And yeah, it was a cool experience.
It was especially cool for me because I had been there initially last year on my way down through Oregon and in the Astoria area, because that's where Fort Clatsop is. It's around Astoria, kind of that area. And you totally kept your visit to Fort Clatsop a secret from me until you sent me pictures. So I had no idea that you were even planning to go. So that was very cool to hear. Oh my gosh, he actually went there. So
Yeah.
we both have been to some of these places. So it wasn't just me. So I feel like that we're both representing part 4 in our own way.
Yeah, it's cool to go to the actual places, and even though it's not the original fort, it's a recreation, but it's so cool to go through the forest and you come out and then you see it and like, oh wow, that's so cool. It looks just like all the descriptions, and I'm gonna add actually to the Instagram page. I'm gonna get around to it. I'm gonna add a reel of the video I took of Clatsop, and I'm gonna kind of put that part from episode 4 in there of the description of it, and you can see the fort had 3 rooms on one side, 4 on the other. The walls were sharpened to a point, and it's just cool to see it in person, and a representative of it.
Yeah, cool to see in person, but probably not cool to stay for 5 months in the worst weather imaginable.
Yeah, 3 months. But yeah, they definitely did not have a fun time there.
Yeah, that was one part of episode 4 that I was really hoping that you would go crazy on the sound effects just to give you an idea of what the weather was like. And it must have just been hell, to be honest, because they were constantly wet. It was raining constantly. I think they had only 12 days of no
12
rain.
12 days without rain, and only
5 months.
Only 6 of those were sunny.
I can't even imagine that.
Well, I can imagine it because I live up here.
That's true. That is
I know
true.
what the winter's like here. It's dark, wet,
staying
damp.
in that one place for 5 straight months. Oh man, there's no way.
Yeah, we got the authentic trip when we went to Clatsop, because it was a terrible day. It rained, it poured the whole time. There were puddles everywhere, and I was like,
probably gave you a very good idea.
This is what it was like. This is what it was like.
Well, it's a bummer you didn't go to Cape Disappointment. I was really hoping you would have hit that spot, because
tell us about that.
That was kind of my trifecta whenever I went through Astoria. So I saw the Seaside Monument, Fort Clatsop, and then Cape Disappointment, which is on the Washington side of the border. Because for those that have never been to Astoria, it's kind of right on the border between Oregon and Washington in this big bay, or Columbia Bay. And Cape Disappointment was where they went to. If I remember correctly, it's where they decided to spend the winter, if I remember right. And I could be wrong about that. It's been a while since we've done the research on it, but it was
they made it up. They made it up into the estuary, and they stayed on the Washington side. Yeah, and then they had the vote, and the vote was to decide where they're going to stay for the winter, and that's the other historic part of the episode, where
one of my favorite parts. Yeah, one of my favorite parts of the journey was the vote that they took.
Yeah, Sacagawea and York are given a vote.
I thought it was the Ken Burns documentary summarizes that moment really, really well. I love how he does it in the documentary.
Yeah, it was cool in the journey and in the journal entry of Clark when he refers to Sacagawea as Janie, and kind of showed that he really thought a lot of her, that he had a nickname for her.
Yeah, her and her son. He had nicknames for both, so nicknames were just as common then as they are now, apparently. And I thought it was very cool, too. Really cool detail about how they actually devoted time to building a separate room just for her and her husband and baby, just for them. I thought you did a really good job of highlighting why that was important and why that was significant.
Yeah, and you can just imagine being the only woman in that camp for 3 months. They're really not doing a whole lot. There's not a lot of, it wasn't like the Mandan stay. They weren't constantly hanging out with the natives, getting to know various people in the tribe and seeing how they do things. There really wasn't that much interaction within those 3 months. There was some, but in comparison, there was hardly any. So they were very bored. They hadn't obviously been around a lot of women in the past year and a half, and she was really in a vulnerable spot. So I thought it was really cool that Lewis and Clark made sure that she was protected, that she had her own room, with a separate door. It was closed off to everyone. And, she had a baby and she needed to care for the child and needed that separate space to do so. So it was cool that even though obviously took more time to build and time to construct, that they gave her own room with Charbonneau.
Yeah, I just thought that was a very interesting detail that is often overlooked when you look into Lewis and Clark. It really is something that's not brought up, but it is significant in its own way.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting too how like you said, there it definitely wasn't like Fort Mandan where they were having constant daily interactions with the Indians, but yeah, they occasionally would fornicate with the Indian women, and it got to the point where I think even Lewis and Clark said, "You guys have to stop doing this." Researching it, there is some theories or indications that some of the men died as a result of syphilis that they contracted from all of that. So
I'm sure.
and I'm sure I feel like that's one of the reasons why. And this is another thing that is absolutely amazing about the expedition, is that there's no real evidence that Lewis and Clark themselves ever engaged in sexual relations with the Indian women. And you sort of get the feeling that they had so many things to take care of that they were just way too busy for it. But you also get a sense that, they're military men and they're fully aware of how the men would perceive them if they themselves also indulged. So you really get that sense that they saw it more from the perspective of, what will the men think of us if we start doing this too? You know, that you get a sense that they were trying. Another great example of their leadership is that you just get the sense that they're trying to hold themselves to a higher standard to try to motivate them. But they also recognize that the men need to blow off some steam,
Yeah.
much to their detriment, because they ended up getting syphilis. So.
I think they recognized that how could they hold the men accountable to not overindulge in that if they were doing the same thing. So as you said, great leadership, great forethought of, okay, we're eventually going to have to put an end to this and put a stop to it. So we can't be indulging ourselves.
I mean, I think you even mentioned it too when we were writing the episodes, as just that must have just been an overwhelming temptation. But then you look at the kind of men they were and you think, well, let's see, we're military officers. We have too many things to do to even think about this, and I don't want to get syphilis. So maybe it wasn't that hard of a decision when you think about it.
Yeah, maybe they actually thought about the consequences more than the other guys.
Yeah. So which virtue stands out to you, or maybe series of virtues, for this particular portion of the expedition?
Yeah, I'd say leadership, because the winter in Fort Clatsop was a misery. I mean, it was just, and I said in the episode, it was really a prison. It wasn't a fort, it was a prison. They were stuck there with very little to do and very little to occupy them. They even ran out of tobacco, for crying out loud. And
absolute hell.
Yeah. They didn't have any booze. They didn't have any alcohol. They didn't have any tobacco left. It ran out. They were using tree bark for tobacco, which must have been interesting. And they didn't have a lot of interaction either. And they weren't allowed to have many Indians within the fort confines because of what the thievery that they experienced coming down to Colombia. So it took a lot of leadership to keep the men together throughout the winter, throughout those 3 months. And in a lot of the journal entries, even Clark sounds pretty melancholy of how things were going. There's one on the episodes where he talks about a bad Christmas dinner. They had some bad boiled elk and some fish that had gone bad and some roots for dinner, and it was a bad Christmas dinner. And then Lewis, being the better writer himself and better thinker, he goes way in depth with the emotions of being away from family during New Year's, and all he can think about is the New Year of 1807 when he's back in the company of his friends. So they were feeling it too, but the leadership that they showed to get the men and themselves through that, I think is really admirable. Okay, final episode 5, The Return Journey. Sounds like a Lord of the Rings movie.
Could be. Another one of the many things I thought was amazing about this part of the return journey itself, it was 6 months to the day from Fort Clatsop to when they got back to St. Louis. 6 months to the day. I mean, that another one of those things, mind blowing.
Not bad. And especially when you consider how many journeys they took that weren't really part of the journey they had to take back. They had so many offshoots and so many splitting up the groups and exploring other areas that they just kind of on a whim decided, hey, let's go check out this area.
And that part of it too, I feel like that part of the journey is just really kind of outside of my realm of understanding. Because reading that, I just think, why would you do this? Like,
Hey,
I
we're
mean,
explorers.
yeah, I feel like that's the only reason that they thought it would be justifiable, is to just see more and to map more and to explore regions that they couldn't on their way to the ocean. But still, I just think, man, there's just no really good reason to do this, especially since Lewis himself said that he wanted to engage with the Blackfeet Nation, which was a really powerful Indian nation, and they also had a pretty fearsome reputation, and I think they were at war with the Nez Perce, so um like just a huge risk, gigantic risk, and that easily could have ended in one or both of them being dead by the end of it. So, and it's also the only, or with when they split up into two separate groups, like Clark goes his way, Lewis goes his way, and they had a bit of a scuffle with some of the Indians when they were trying to take some of their horses and rifles and everything, and they ended up killing two of the Indians in the entire expedition. That's the only incident of violence between the core of Discovery and the Indian tribes in the entire expedition. That's the only time.
Yeah.
So, which is amazing in and of itself, that in almost 3 years of being out there, that was the only time. It's just amazing.
I was thinking about the return journey, and it's almost like a mountaineer climbing Everest, and then on the way back down, they're like, you know what? We could go just straight back down to base camp, but why don't we go off here, offshoot here, and we'll also climb that mountain. And then when we're done with that one, let's go try check out this one as well before we go back to base camp. It's like, how do you have the mental energy and the physical energy to do stuff like that?
Oh, for sure. Well, especially something like Everest, where you're half dead by the time you get to the top of the mountain. So I just think, yeah, I mean, obviously they were not in a position like that, but still, it just makes you wonder why they did it. And I just feel like the exploration aspect is the only reason. And also, too, because they were also on a mission of empire. They're trying to recruit the Indian tribes into the American empire in their own way. So there's also that element as well. But
Yeah,
yeah, the whole division, I think, was ultimately an ambitious failure. And the fact that they both made it out alive is pretty impressive.
they definitely didn't settle for what they'd already accomplished.
And also, too, I think one of the most interesting aspects of the return journey is the fact that Lewis seems to have changed into a totally different person by the time they head back.
Yeah, you mentioned that in
Like,
the episode.
he has this hot temper. He just can't handle the Indians stealing from him. He almost burns down a village because they took some
Yeah.
articles of clothing, and they even took his dog for a time, and he was ready to kill them
Yeah.
all.
Don't steal a man's dog, whatever you do.
It's just, yeah, I mean, but yeah, and just totally out of character for Lewis from the journey to the ocean and back. It's like Lewis turned into a totally different person on the way back, and you get the sense that he's frustrated, he's irritable, he's ready to get home, and he is not going to take no for an answer.
Not gonna
And
let anything get in his way.
it led to some really big mistakes and things that thankfully didn't end in worse disaster. But yeah, he definitely seems to have lost his propensity for good judgment on the way back in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And then he gets shot in the butt.
Yeah, which was golden opportunity for a joke, which of course I took advantage of.
So what was your favorite quote of episode 5?
My favorite quote is whenever Jefferson replies to his letter after they've returned. So after they get back to St. Louis, 6 months to the day, Lewis writes a letter to Jefferson just saying, "We've returned with the safe return of our party, minus Charles Floyd, of course." And then Jefferson's reply, because very often in researching this expedition, you tend to forget about Jefferson a lot of the time because you're so focused on the men and their journey that you forget the man who authored the expedition in the first place. And then when they get back to St. Louis, you realize, oh yeah, Jefferson, what about him? What's he been up to this whole time? And his reply to Lewis's letter gives you an idea that he was probably in a lot of agony over it, because he had not received any word from them from when they were first with the Mandan village. And so this whole time he can do nothing but worry and wonder for an incredible amount of time. So
And he thought he would probably hear from them when they were at the Pacific from, the ships that were there. Maybe he would get some correspondence back, but he didn't.
yeah. So, I mean, what a terrible state of mind for Jefferson, just wondering every day, did they even make it? Because if they vanish, they vanish. There's no way anyone would ever know what would have happened to them. Because
Yeah,
they're out
most
there
likely
they're
not.
out there, they're off the map. So if that had happened, Jefferson would have never known. So you can just imagine the joy that he had when he realized, oh my gosh, they made it. I mean, he must have just been beside himself.
Washington, October 20th, 1806. I received, my dear sir, with unspeakable joy, your letter announcing the return of yourself, Captain Clark, and your party in good health to St. Louis. The unknown scenes in which you were engaged and the length of time without hearing of you had begun to be felt awfully.
It almost sounds like that's a letter from a father to a son.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. There's definitely
And
an element of that.
And I think it's funny because your dad read that quote for the episode.
Yeah, that's right. Another one of the unsung heroes of the Lewis and Clark expedition, Virtuous Men
It was
edition.
kind of cool because you being away, I went over to your dad's place, and that was kind of fun, him reading those and me just sitting and listening. And I really think he's the perfect character to have played Jefferson in this, because he just has the perfect voice for it.
Oh yeah, I know. My dad's got a good reading voice, I think.
Yeah.
And what was especially interesting about that, and I never told you because I just couldn't bring myself to, is when you had that session of going over to my dad's house to record those lines, I had neglected to put some lines in there. So I just thought, oh my gosh, how is Jamie going to have time to do this again? So I was just freaking out. And then I had this idea. Oh my gosh, my folks are coming to visit me really soon. So I'll just have my dad record it when they come and visit me.
Okay, so
And that's how it
some lines
works.
that he didn't read when I was over there that he did when you guys were in what?
Yeah.
New Orleans?
I think all of part 5, all the stuff that my dad read was not in the stuff that I initially sent you.
Oh, that's great.
So
I love that I'm finding this out while we're recording Loose and Unscripted.
Talk about serendipitous. Yeah. I was saving it for Loose and Unscripted to let you know. Yeah, I failed big time, and then I totally redeemed myself.
Yeah, and of course, be remiss if I didn't mention the sad part in episode 5, which is, of course, Lewis's apparent suicide.
Yeah.
I thought you did a good job of going through that scene and what we know of what happened. And obviously it is still kind of shrouded in mystery of did he actually commit suicide, or was there something more sinister? Going back to Larry's book, The Fate of the Corps, he has a really cool chapter on Lewis's death and all the oddities that are involved in it. His stay where he was, what he was doing, the people who were there, kind of shady characters. And it does kind of leave you wondering what really did happen, and I don't think we'll ever know, sadly.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual details, I think, yeah, there's no way of knowing, but knowing the kind of person that Lewis was, I mean, suicide was an obvious candidate, just given the kind of person he was. And the fact that if you look at Jefferson's and Clark's responses to his death, it's like they're not even shocked by it. It's almost like they were just waiting for the day that it was going to happen. And the fact that they were the two men who knew him better than anyone, and there's just the sense that they were almost waiting for Lewis to do it at some point, and then he does it, and they're just thinking, well, it finally happened.
So sad, because such an incredible guy who had such a future if he would have been able to get things together, but he just was never able to do that after the expedition. I think he just missed. He missed I think this is another thing you did really well in episode 5 of speaking to how much Lewis missed just the camaraderie, the brotherhood, the friendship that they enjoyed, and the adventure and the exploration of the journey. And then all of that was just gone, and he was left with this empty hole in his life that was then filled with just the bureaucracy of the job that he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Ambrose did it. He summarized that perfectly in his book Undaunted Courage, where he described Lewis as a wonderful leader, but a terrible politician. And you definitely get a sense of that, where he was clearly put in a role that he was not equipped for. Like, he was not a politician. He was a military man, and he was an explorer and a leader, but he was not a politician. So the fact that
Right.
one of his rewards, and I don't know how much you could really blame this, quote unquote, on Jefferson for giving him the role of governor of the Louisiana Territory. I imagine, when I see that, I just think to myself, wow, well, he probably thought that that was a huge honor and that Lewis would have loved it. And maybe he did initially, but then realizing that he's just not equipped for that role. If certain things had been different, that he would have had a successful life like Clark did.
Yeah, it is interesting that obviously Lewis is the more educated and well-spoken of the two, but what Clark did with his opportunities that came his way after the expedition that he earned by leading the expedition was certainly admirable. With what he did with his fame, he really did use it for his benefit. Sadly, Lewis didn't.
Yeah, well, I think it's also pretty sad too that he never found a wife. I always thought that was a particularly sad thing about his story, because you sort of get a sense too in letters that he wrote to friends that he really expressed his desire for a wife. And it's hard to think of a more perfect candidate for husband material than Lewis, given the fact that he was a celebrity, he had power, he had influence, he had wealth, and yet no woman would marry him. And it's just,
and especially back then, I mean, those things, they're important now too, but back then, I mean, those things were golden. I mean, that's what a woman would desire. And obviously back then in the upper classes, likely one's wife would be somewhat chosen by her family. She would be placed in a scenario where that would likely happen, where the two would meet, and it just never seemed to work out for him.
Well, and given the fact that he's, moving in the higher ups of American society, so it's not like there was a shortage of women around, but it's just really unfortunate. I felt I think it's another one of those things where if he had found himself a wife, I think he probably would have made it past. Sure. He would have had a long, successful life if he had found a wife. So I just always thought that was a very tragic thing.
Yeah, I guess it's a lesson of what can happen to a great man when he doesn't have something pure and good to fight for.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like, it was another one of those things where you look at his life after the expedition, and I summarized it in the episode. It was a recipe for disaster.
Yep.
That he doesn't have a wife to share his new life with and to motivate him. He doesn't have the camaraderie that he had out there on the journey. He's in a role that he's not suited for. And just given the kind of person that Lewis was, like, there's no way he was going to come out of that unscathed.
Yeah, he wasn't the type of guy who could sit behind a desk all day and sign notices and orders, and that was his life.
Yeah. No thanks.
So what was your favorite part of the episode 5?
I think my favorite part was probably detailing what happened to the men after the expedition, because that's another one of those things where I'm always fascinated by that, and especially because it's hardly really given a lot of detail. Because, like I said, anytime you talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition, you tend to only hear about Lewis and Clark and maybe Sacagawea. You never hear about the men. So hearing about what happened to the men after the expedition was very interesting. Like, I was actually tempted to just write down every man in the expedition and what happened to him, but that would have, of course, bogged the whole thing down. But
episode 5 would have been 2 hours long.
Exactly, right. I mean, and some men, there really isn't a lot of information about what happened to them. I mean, there's a few who had pretty prominent lives after the expedition, and then there's some that kind of just fade into history. But it's just fascinating, because it's another one of those things where I think maybe we've experienced this at some point in our life, where you have a solid group of people that you're really, really close to, and then you separate, and you either never get together again or you never correspond again, but you just kind of go your separate ways, and that bond is broken forever. And
Right.
I know, look, I mean, I've had experiences like that where I think leaving high school was a good example where I felt like I lost a lot of those friendships. And I kind of learned the hard way in my life that friendship very often doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
It's very rare to find a friend for life. And you sort of get a sense that it was like that for the Lewis and Clark expedition, where, okay, we've had this unbelievable journey. We're back to our lives, and now we're just going to go our separate ways. So
Are you
there's
trying to tell
something
me
kind of
something here,
there's something
Scott?
kind of bit yeah. I just wanted to let you know that this is our final episode of Virtuous Men. That I'm never coming home.
And final shout out to old Gassy. He lived to be what, 99?
Yep, and
That's
oh yeah,
amazing.
he had one of the more interesting post expedition lives, I think,
Well, yeah,
of all the
he
men.
was the one who published his journals first, right?
Yeah, and
He's where we get the word where we get the term Corps of Discovery from.
Yeah, I think it was his journals where that was first discovered. So I'm not sure if he actually thought of it, but that's just where it was found. But and and even at age 90, he had lost an eye, I think, in the War of 1812. And even at age 90, without an eye, he volunteers to fight for the Union in the Civil War. I mean, can you imagine? Like, I mean,
the fact that he was even alive for the Civil War when he was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he was one of the oldest members, if I'm not mistaken, too, right?
Yeah, he was one of the older members of the expedition, and I think when they started, he was only 33 at the time, if I remember right. So, which I guess gives you an idea of how young the guys were.
Right. So what did you learn from the episode? I mean, we've kind of covered a lot of that, but is there something specific or a specific virtue?
Yeah, just this whole notion of friendship and brotherhood and everything. I think that is really the greatest lesson, not just of this episode, but just the entire expedition in general. Is I think it all goes back to that, is the relationships that these men had with one another, with what Lewis and Clark had with one another, and how that propelled them to lead the expedition the way that they did, and just the friendship and camaraderie, the brotherhood, all of that. I think those virtues of brotherhood and loyalty and friendship and relationship, I think all of that comes together to be the great lesson of the Lewis and Clark expedition. We can do great things on our own, but imagine what we could do if we were together. I feel like that's really, and I feel like that really describes, I think, the American spirit in a lot of ways, because that's exactly what happened in the wake of the expedition is groups of people doing things together to make this dream of America happen.
Yeah, that's a good way to end this. I think brotherhood and camaraderie, it's something that men need. They need, I think that's in a lot of ways why men need a challenge. They need something to fight against, some adversity. And today's man, there really isn't a lot of that in a lot of our lives. But it sounds funny, but I think we need to find something to fight for, something worth fighting for, and a crew of brothers. That's what men need. And yeah, I think the Corps of Discovery it lives on even today, over 200 years later, because of the qualities that it has for men to live up to. Before we end, I want to give a thank you to our interviewees, Larry Morris and Ellen Woodger. Big thanks to them for the time they spent with us. We had very lengthy interviews with them just because we had so many questions for the entire season. But the interviews were really fun, just getting to know them and their passion for Lewis and Clark, the books that they've read, the research they've done. Big thanks to them. Larry's books are The Fate of the Corps, talking about what happened to all the Corps members. And also he wrote In the Wake of Lewis and Clark, which gives a picture of kind of even more step forward in time from the expedition and Manifest Destiny and all of the migration westward. And then Ellen wrote Encyclopedia of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which is a really cool read. It's not really a read from front to back, obviously. There's so much information in there. You can kind of go to a certain subject of the expedition. There's great maps in there. that was a cool resource for us. So thank you for both of them for spending the time with us, being part of the episode, and wish them all the best. And then I want to say thanks to our voice actors for this season. Ethan Thomas for the voice of Meriwether Lewis, his brother Jared Thomas for the voice of William Clark. We had Scott, your voice acting talents for old Patrick Gass.
That's right.
And my wife Stacy for Watkowis in episode 4. And of course, the one and only Larry Einig for the voice of Thomas Jefferson in 1 and 5. Who did I forget? Anybody?
Nope, you hit them all.
Good stuff. Yeah, thanks to everyone for being part of the season. It was a lot of fun to have so many different voices in this season, and I think it really brought the quotes alive. That concludes part 1 of Loose and Unscripted. We're going to have part 2 coming here soon. We're going to interview the voices of Lewis and Clark, Ethan and Jared Thomas. We're going to chat a little bit about their recordings of the quotes, and just a little chat about what we all think about the expedition. Specifically, I think the Brotherhood. We'll get into that a little more, because they are, after all, our brother's creed.
It kind of makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah. And we want to say, if you've enjoyed season 4, if you enjoyed the episodes, let us know. You can send us messages on the Instagram page. And above all, if you really liked listening to this stuff, you can help us out by giving us rating. You can rate, review, send us a comment on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening. Make sure you share with others you think would enjoy the season. That really helps us reach more people, which is really our goal right now. We're trying to reach more people with our content and finding other people who enjoy these virtues and hearing about these incredible men. So go ahead and subscribe. Here's your chance. We're waiting.
Just do it!
You have no more excuses. If you've been listening to us since it's season 1, it's season 4. Just go ahead and subscribe. Just do it.
What if we said please?
Please do it.
Wow. Nicest podcasters out there. Do it now! All right, that's a wrap for part 1 of Loose and Unscripted. We will see you soon for part 2. Cheers.
Cheers.
Boom. Go for it.
Welcome to Loose and Unscripted, an inside look at season 4 of the Virtuous Men Spotcast. I was doing so well until like the 4th word.
To go on.